Okay, so today we're going to talk about the principles of cloud financial management at a high level, and we're going to move through this quickly just so you can get an idea. If you're new to FinOps or financial operations, you can get an idea of some of the core tenets. So a good starting point is to think of this in terms of cost management and optimization. So the resources that you deploy in the cloud, you want to make sure you're using efficiently. And you want to make sure that the architecture is sound and is appropriate in terms of cost. If you can re-architect to save money, that should be explored. Not necessarily should be done, but should be explored. And there are tools within AWS, for example, where you can utilize savings plans to save quite a bit of money in the account, depending on your usage. So the way I see it, there are two main pillars of FinOps, financial operations. One is visibility, the other is accountability. And this will become clear in some of the future slides. And value must be assessed by the organization or the business at regular intervals throughout the year and throughout the years. So at the outset, and at regular intervals, teams must assess if the value of the resource they're deploying into the account exceeds its cost. So if the value does not exceed the cost, then changes need to be made. Resource usage changes and architecture changes, like I mentioned before, are examples of this. If the value does exceed the cost, then changes don't need to be made from a cost point of view. And teams should think in terms of sales. They should be ensuring that there is margin in what they deliver. So governance is a key component of FinOps, and cost evaluation is as well. You should set and abide by standards and constantly or periodically at least ask the question, how can I accomplish my business goals for the least amount of cloud spend? And another way of thinking is, how much is this costing me per customer? So you'll want to adopt that thinking if you want to charge back, or perhaps you have partnerships with other businesses or other types of customer relationships where perhaps you would need to set up an environment for that partner in your account. How would you charge back for that? So forecasting and monitoring are very important components to FinOps. And understanding when and where to make changes and how those changes will be made. Understanding what's coming down the line, meaning what products are the applications teams or other business entities going to be deploying in the cloud. We need to know it's coming for our forecasting, and we need to monitor it closely, especially if it's new, to understand what it's going to cost and have some historical data there. So what's driving your cost? How do you measure efficiency? What's the budget? Who's paying for it? Those are also very important questions to ask. There are lots of tools to understand cloud cost. You can analyze real-time billing and cost data in the AWS Cost Explorer dashboard, for example. You can develop your own reports using Tableau or even AWS native reports. And of course, this applies to GCP and Azure as well. You can implement account guardrails and set budget alerts. Budget alerts are very important in my view. I can set using AWS budgets, I can set a daily threshold and be alerted via email if we exceed that threshold in an account, for example. So it's a quick and easy way to understand if cost is exploding in the wrong direction. So let's talk about opportunities and process here. And how we access data. So I like this first line. You can treat mistakes, and you should, I think, treat mistakes as blameless opportunities to learn and improve existing processes. Again, you want to ask, what business value are we getting from this periodically as you build, as the business builds in the cloud, and ask it at regular intervals. You decide when, monthly, quarterly, biannually, whatever you want, but you should be asking and checking this often. And you want to provide, I think it's a good idea to provide access to the real-time or reporting cost reports for cost and billing data to all layers of the organization, not just executive leadership or IT finance. This way the data is transparent, the information is transparent For example, providing the invoice to the development team so that they can break it down by service and see what they're spending. Perhaps they would see larger than usual or larger than expected EC2 service usage, and they could understand that they could perhaps re-architect their solution using Lambda functions to save money, for example. And this access to the data, making it transparent, reduces the likelihood of an invoice surprise coming in much higher than expected. Tagging is a great way to allocate spend to specific P&Ls, and if taggable resources are shared across multiple lines of business, the cost can be divided among those lines of business using, for example, headcount or business revenue of each line. A couple quick definitions. Chargeback means that the business units pay their invoices. Showback means central IT or IT finance, profit and loss, pays the bill and reports the cost back to each of the business units. So committed use and reservations are a great way to save a lot of money if you know what your long-term usage is going to be, especially around virtual instances or compute or EC2 and AWS. You can optimize costs with committed use discounts. The downside is if you sign a 3-year contract and after year 1 you decide you don't need it anymore, you're stuck with it. So forecasting is also very important. You want to forecast and you want it to be accurate so that the business can understand if they're doing what they planned. When they budget, they plan per month what they're going to spend in the cloud or per year. And you want to forecast that, and you want that forecast to be accurate. And you need to monitor the forecast and monitor the actuals as well. Obviously, you want to minimize waste. So AWS, for example, provides recommendations for right-sizing resources to minimize the waste and maximize the value. You want to leverage that. Leverage auto-scaling groups, for example, and scheduling virtual machine on-off, for example, based on expected utilization patterns for scaling, and then scheduling based on maybe Monday through Friday, a developer workstation, for example. And then inspect your deployment at regular intervals for cost optimization opportunities. Start with that low-hanging fruit, and it gets easier over time, especially as folks get more familiar with the process. So if you're moving from on-prem to cloud, you should decide if you want to compare on-prem cost with cloud cost. Sometimes businesses are sold the idea that moving from on-prem to the cloud is going to be cheaper. In reality, sometimes it is not. So decide from the outset if you want to know that, and you can compare on-prem versus cloud. So in a chargeback scenario, which is known as computed billing, you could use something like Billing Conductor in AWS to create custom groupings of the accounts in the organization. So you could group by application team, for example. And in chargeback, that's called computed billing. Cost anomaly detection is another great way to minimize surprises. So you'll be alerted if the observed history breaches a threshold. So when unusual spend is detected in the account, you can use the AWS built-ins or set your custom monitors. Again, I'm speaking mostly to AWS, but I imagine Azure and GCP have some of the same mechanisms. You can use AWS Services Monitor along with a cost monitor to get started with that in AWS. So I already mentioned savings plans, so you could purchase that 1 year or that 3-year savings plan for Lambda or for EC2. And then I also mentioned AWS recommendations because that informs your savings plan decision. And you want to wait about 90 days of account activity. If you have a production environment, or if you have a pre-production environment, maybe you could examine that for about 90 days to understand possibly what production would cost. Although production real-world scenarios with real-world traffic, especially with ingress and egress, could vary dramatically from pre-production or any of the other lower tiers. So consider, if you're CIO, CTO, consider holding workshops for your organization where you can review some of this information. You could look at account current month spend per day grouped by service, for example, in Cost Explorer in AWS. You could, for those that may not know much about CloudWatch monitoring or CloudWatch metrics, you could show how an EC2 is being underutilized, perhaps with memory or CPU or disk. Take a look at CPU credit balances, because with certain instance types, when they stop, you lose your credits after 7 days. So if you could consume those credits before they're lost, that would be ideal. If you're using containers, you could look at Fargate or ECS tagging to allocate costs in that way. AWS provides a right-sizing dashboard for Fargate, which is a good workshop. You could do an entire workshop on just that to get familiar with right-sizing Fargate. As I stated earlier, instant scheduling is a great way to do this as well, and then leave time in your meetings in your workshop meetings for discussion and Q&A. Another example of some workshop agenda items: you could look at anomaly detections, and analyze them. You can identify services in the account that would benefit from anomaly detection, and you can set up anomaly detection on those services. And you can discuss data transfer costs, which is sometimes where costs can really get out of control, especially on the egress side. Generally speaking, ingress is either free or very low cost, and egress, depending on where the data is going, can be very costly. It just depends. So there's a lot just on data transfer to try to understand. Very difficult to forecast this. And again, leave time for discussion and Q&A. Azure, we've been talking about AWS mostly so far, but with Azure, you can use their cost management and billing feature. And they used to have something, I believe, called Cloud-In, but it's been deprecated. Everything's rolled into, I believe they purchased Cloud-In, and they rolled those features into Azure Cost Management. Again, to the accountability that we spoke about earlier, you have budgets, you have chargebacks, and you have cost allocation. And budgets can start automated actions using Azure Action Groups, which is really nice. So when a budget is exceeded, perhaps you could shut down a virtual machine or prevent the launching of future resources, for example, because your threshold was breached. So that's an automated action using an Azure Action Group. You can use your custom dashboards with Power BI, Tableau, others, and advisor recommendations is what Azure calls it. AWS calls it AWS recommendations to right size or shut down underutilized virtual machines. And finally, some additional considerations here. You should promote the enforcement of tagging and other standards to enable successful FinOps and cloud cost health. How you define success in FinOps, that's a little bit of a gray area, but it should be promoted to enforce tagging and other standards in order to really have successful FinOps overall. Again, those committed use and reservations, if you can do it, do it. And provide training and ongoing education and awareness for developers, especially, to establish and maintain proper cloud consumption and cost hygiene. Some of this goes back to the visibility and accountability pieces that we spoke of earlier. Define your desired outcomes and the tangible benefits of your FinOps strategy. So basically, define what you want out of this. Is the main thing that you want no surprise bills, for example, if you want to really simplify. Define progress, define how you're going to measure success, and define the roles and responsibilities for successful FinOps. Some organizations have a full-time cloud cost full-time employee. So if your organization can afford this, that should be explored. So I hope you enjoyed this, the principles of cloud financial management. If you have any questions, obviously this was a quick run through, but if you have any questions or comments, please leave it below this video, and thanks for watching.